All right, everybody, welcome to Objective H, evaluating processes and forces active in American elections. Everybody likes talking about elections, and this is your chance to get all the information that you so desperately want. To begin with, we have to talk about voting. A vote is a way to register your opinion. However, the Constitution is a bit ambivalent about our ability to give a good opinion. The Founding Fathers did not think that all Americans really had that great of an opinion. At the time of the founding of the Republic, a majority of Americans could not read and write, and the Founding Fathers feared that we would pick the wrong person for the job. And this is shown by the fact that in the Constitution, only members of the House of Representatives were directly elected. Originally, senators at the federal level were chosen by state legislatures, and the president was not directly elected either. Now, we changed the direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment, but we are still not directly electing our president, and we'll spend much of this short video talking about that. What do elections do? They help us select leaders. They direct policy, which is something that people don't often think about. If voters really line up behind an issue, then politicians respond to that ideally, and they will put policies in place to put the will of the people forward. Elections inform people about issues. They contain conflict and stabilize the system. When we vote, we are saying we are not going to engage in violent revolution. We are going to vote our leaders in and out instead of violently overthrowing them. It allows our political and social conflicts to be argued in a civil, democratic manner. This is, most people think, preferable to how we have done things in the past, where in ancient times the strongest would be the leader, or the person whose family was the leader to begin with would be the current leader. Now we're going to contain those problems. We're going to have a legitimate system based on voting and elections. Now, that's an idealized version of the world, but that's what we're talking about right now. Is in a perfectly democratic society, everyone would vote, and the system would be reflective of the true will of the majority. But not everyone votes in America, and that is one problem that we face. There's actually real problems with voter turnout. And here are a few trends. The first one, and this is much talked about, is age. Younger people, particularly those in the 18 to 24 year age group, vote less frequently. Now, some younger Americans are starting to vote more regularly, but if you are 18 to 24, odds are you are not voting. That is bad. Young people, please go out and vote. Please make your voices heard. If you do not allow your voices to be heard, the people who do vote, namely your elders, especially your retired elders, their ideas are the ones put into policy. So if you care about things like college debt, home mortgages, finding your first job, you need to vote so that politicians will listen to you and put into place policies that will help you. If you don't vote, politicians will continue to focus on issues that benefit older Americans, such as retirement, health care, and things of that nature. Next trend is income. Poorer Americans tend to vote less frequently for various reasons. Some having to do with ballot access laws, some having to do with motivation, some having to do with the criminal justice system, where some Americans are shut out of voting after getting a felony conviction, and those Americans tend to be poorer. But in general, the poorer you are, the less likely you are to vote. Also, the less educated you are, the less likely you are to vote. The most educated people in the country tend to vote the most often because they see the power of the vote and they see their action as being efficacious. However, if you're less educated, you might not see that connection. There are also differences in racial and ethnic groups. Most racial and ethnic minorities vote less frequently than do majority Americans. This is changing as well in modern America, especially as white people become a minority demographically. Non-white individuals' voting habits are beginning to be reflective of their majority status. But historically, minorities have voted less frequently than whites. There are also legal obstacles, such as registration. In many states, you have to register a month ahead of an election, at least. For many people, this is too soon because they aren't paying attention to an election. For some reason, we have set our voting day as Tuesday. This is not a convenient day for many people to vote, especially people who work for a living. And we have very frequent elections, some of which are more important than others. So there are kind of some legal reasons people don't vote, but the bigger ones have to do with attitudes. Voters tend to be apathetic. They believe that they are less efficacious. Efficacious means you think that what you do matters. So if you have a high sense of political efficacy, you believe that what you're doing has an impact. People have stopped believing that what they do has an impact, and this has led to a decrease in the voter turnout. People are also identifying less with political parties. As the number of independent voters in the country has increased and the number of registered Democrats and Republicans has decreased, this means that people vote less because when they go in, they aren't sure if they should just vote for all of their party's candidates because they aren't in a party anymore. The Electoral College, at least for presidential politics, has really driven down voting as well. Many people perceive, and there is some justification for this perception, that if you're not in a swing state, Ohio, Florida, Virginia, Pennsylvania, if you're not in one of those 4 states, that your vote doesn't really matter. And there is some justification for that. However, the overall point that everyone's vote is counted in some way should be kept in mind. There are also voter mobilization efforts. Republicans tend to do less of this than Democrats, though that's not always true. So depending on how much the parties work, voters get mobilized to different levels. I want you to take a look at this map. This has to do with felons and people who have a felony, whether they get their voting rights back. So here you see there are 2 states that have no restrictions. Felons can vote even inside of prison. Most other states, the other 48, have some level of restrictions. 14 of them, you have to at least be out of prison. But after you're out of prison, if you're a felon, you can vote. 4 of them, you can't be on parole. 20 of them is post-sentence, which means prison, parole, probation, all that has to be over. Then you can vote. Some of them, you have to finish your sentence and then a waiting period. But 8 states, you can never vote again if you are convicted of a felony. Those are very serious. That's a very serious issue in those states, especially if you have a criminal justice system that disproportionately targets minorities. That would mean that in those states, those people who are targeted by the criminal justice system would then lose their voting rights at a higher rate than non-minority communities. That means that has serious consequences for democratic functioning, especially in those states. Beyond this, there is a decrease in social connection. People in modern America tend to not join groups. They tend to not feel like they belong in a community. They tend to do things alone. And this decrease in social connection has led to a decrease in voting. There are also generational changes. This is kind of a stereotype, but it does hold up to be true. The younger generations, Generation X, the millennials, they vote less and they're less politically active than the baby boomers, though that may change as we move forward. There are some people who are what we call rational non-voters. They tabulate and calculate that their vote will not make a difference, and this is really exacerbated by the Electoral College. They figure, if my vote doesn't count, I just don't care, and I won't show up. There are many arguments against rational non-voting, the biggest of which is that everyone's vote in a democracy is registered in some way. So if you go in and you write in for your candidate, "I hate the system," as your write-in candidate, that is registered that people are dissatisfied. So even if you are very unhappy with the political system, you should still go and vote to at least register your displeasure. And lastly, and this is a very serious issue as well, people just don't know what candidates are about. They don't understand the politics of their world. They don't follow it. They are too distracted by celebrity gossip and the latest electronic gadget to pay any attention to their own politics. So decreased civic literacy is a really serious element, and that is part of the reason that this video series exists. If you take a look, here are voter turnouts in presidential elections from 1988 to 2012. The 65 and older group, the line up there at the top, they are always in the 70, 75, 72% range. That means generally 3 out of 4 or so older people are voting in every election no matter what. If you look at the youngest age group, 18 to 24-year-olds, they're all over the place. In some elections, such as the first election of Bill Clinton in 1992, you had half of them show out. In the first election of President Obama in 2008, you had about half of them show up. But in those other kinds of off years, the second election of Bill Clinton, the first election of George Bush, in 96 and 2000, you're only having a little bit more than 1/3 of your young people who are eligible to vote actually show up. If 1/3 of the 18 to 24-year-olds show up, their voice is never going to be counted. And that should be taken very seriously, especially those of you who are in that age group who are watching this video. Let's talk briefly here about, does non-voting matter? We make a big deal about people who don't vote, but do we actually care? Two schools of thought on this. First, no, it does not matter. Some people hold that non-voting really does not matter. It's unlikely. If it did matter, it would probably harm the Democratic Party, because Democratic voters tend to be minority and tend to be less financially well off than Republicans, and these people are often non-voters. But non-voters, when you study them as a group, they tend to be very fickle. They tend to be influenced by short-term factors. They tend to vote for winning candidates anyway. So if most of the non-voters were going to vote for the winner anyhow, it ends up that it probably doesn't much matter if they don't vote. However, we do come back to this idea that there are consequences for our democracy if people don't vote. If the voter turnout's very low, then that election might be considered illegitimate. And the leaders who are produced from that election, who are chosen in that election, may have a very hard time doing what they're supposed to be doing or what they wish to be doing. All right, let's answer a question here. Pause the video on this question slide and explain, why don't people vote? Discuss 3 of the reasons and then explain what the ramifications of this are for our democracy. Pause the video, take a moment, do that, then when you're ready, move on. Now let's talk about how voters decide. So when you're in the voting booth, how do you make up your mind? The short answer to this question is it depends on your party. If you identify with the Democrats, you tend to vote Democrat. If you identify Republican, you tend to vote Republican. And if you're an independent, you just make up your own mind as you see fit. Party identification is by far the biggest single factor accounting for how people vote. It also influences how you perceive issues, how you evaluate candidates, where if you're a Republican voter and the Republican candidate may have some flaws, you're more willing to overlook those flaws based on your political identification. Sometimes social groups also can swing to one candidate or another. A great example of this is the African American voter turnout for President Obama in 2008 and 2012. That group, which tends to be Democratic anyway, voted overwhelmingly for Obama, which did contribute to his election day victories. Policies also matter. Many voters don't vote based on their ideas, but they vote on what their party tells them to. So if the party labels a policy as something that it wants to see approved or disapproved, then that party's voters will tend to line up behind that. For example, Republicans are very strongly pro-gun rights, pro-Second Amendment rights. So when voters go in to vote on issues, they will vote on gun issues as a Republican, and they know that that party supports that particular idea. However, you should keep in mind that some issues are just too hard for the average voter to comprehend. When you get into the voting booth, if an issue that you're voting on requires you to read pages and pages, most people just won't do that. So when issues are too complicated, and this has happened recently in Ohio on our marijuana legalization, our casino legalization packages, many people vote against those simply because they're so complicated that they don't understand them. In addition, the media has a huge impact on how people vote, and this really cannot be overstated. If the media favorably portrays an issue or a candidate, then that candidate or issue is much more likely to be approved. We're going to spend some time at the end of the video talking about specific ways in which the media can be used to help or hinder a candidate or an issue. But the media does play a big role. Let's talk about two kinds of voting. One is known as prospective, and the other one is retrospective. Prospective voting, the first one on the page there, this is the idealized model of policy voting. This is what we want in our democracy. A prospective voter is one that goes into the voting booth after having researched the issues, considered the future consequences, and really tried to make a rational decision based on evidence. That's what we want our voters to be, and many of them are prospective voters. However, most often, many voters are what we call retrospective voters. These are when you base your vote on past performances. So the last Democratic president didn't do a good job with the economy. I'm not going to vote for this Democrat because of the economy. You view your vote as an approval or a disapproval of the status quo. You are looking at economic or other policy issues in general. You're not really looking at the logic behind the vote. You're looking at your vote as one part of a bigger scheme or as an evaluation of the past. That is retrospective voting, and that is what a lot of voters do. The candidates matter. We should never forget that. The candidates are very, very important in an election. Voters will have clear opinions about candidates. Whether those opinions are accurate or not is an entire other consideration. For example, many politicians are labeled as not intelligent. This is probably not true. However, after people get that perception about them, it can really harm them in an election. All right, next question. Take a look at some of those factors that play into American voter decision making. Which ones are the most important? Which ones are the least important? Pause the video here for a moment, answer that question. When you're ready, come back and continue. All right, let's take some time now and discuss presidential campaigns. The presidential elections are the ones where Americans generally pay attention, so it's important that we understand what the forces are at play in presidential campaigns, and we can take a look at who gets to be the President of the United States of America. To begin with, please know this. The presidential campaign season is long. It starts years, up to 2 years, before the actual election for the president occurs. It begins with what we call a pre-primary season. We sometimes refer to this as the invisible primary because a lot of people don't really know what's happening at this level. Here is where the candidates who might be president form exploratory committees to look at running for president. They begin to look at raising money. They begin to do some things to bolster their image as a presidential level contender. They file some paperwork. This is the part that's very mechanical and serves as an early weed out for people who really aren't going to make it very far. If you survive pre-primary season and you declare you are a candidate for your party's nomination, you then have to contend with the other people who want to be president from your own party. This is done in a caucus or primary selection process. A caucus is a local gathering of party members to choose people to go to the national convention where the actual candidate will be selected. A primary, such as the one we have in Ohio, is an election where voters from that party choose the delegates who will then go to the convention to pick a candidate. So the caucus and the primary, the function of both of these is to select people who go to the conventions. The conventions are where the parties select their actual candidates and a bunch of other stuff happens. But the main objective of the convention, the nominating convention, is to choose who will be the president and the vice presidential candidate for each party. How do we decide who those people will be? Caucuses and primaries. One distinction here. There are both open and closed primaries. In an open primary, anyone can go and vote for the delegates that go to the convention. So you could be a Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, etc., etc. You vote in the primary for who your state thinks should be the nominee for the party of choice. A closed primary is the same idea, or a similar idea, I should say, except in a closed primary, only party members vote. So in a closed primary, and Ohio is a closed primary state, if you're a Democrat, you go to the polls and you can only vote for Democrats, and then you get to pick who you think should run for president. So the primary is like a pre-election, and then to build up to the primary, there's all these other steps, caucuses and primaries and meetings and paperwork and fundraising. It's a very big process. Why? Because being president is so important. If you're the president of the United States, you have vast amounts of power, prestige, and respect. You will be a historically significant figure no matter if you are a great president or a mediocre one. So being president matters, and we put a lot of energy into deciding who will be our president. A lot of the primary and caucus season is front-loaded. This means that the states that happen first in the primary season, and this will begin in January of a presidential election year, the states that happen the soonest matter the most. Iowa has a law on the books saying it has to have the first caucus in the country. New Hampshire has a law saying it has to be the first primary. So these two states, Iowa and New Hampshire, are always very important early indicators of who will win a party's presidential nomination. If you win in Iowa, and if you win in New Hampshire, or even if you win in just one of those, you could be considered a front runner. A front runner is the leading candidate, the person who's expected to win the nomination. You then get what we call momentum, because as people point to you as the front runner, more and more people begin to identify you as the candidate of choice. And as that happens, more and more people who are not very well informed about politics, perhaps, will immediately begin to think that the front runner has the best chance of winning, and votes will begin to go to that person. And this is really decided in these early primary states of Iowa and New Hampshire. Then you finally, after every state has a primary or has a caucus, and all the delegates are selected, then you go to the conventions. The conventions are these big media events, and there's all these things that happen at conventions, and all the important party members from a particular party will be there. And the convention then is the formal way to decide who the presidential nominee will be. So, for example, in 2016, the Democrats are looking at Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley. One of these individuals will be the nominee for the Democratic Party. When the Democrats get to their convention in early 2016, they will, or in the summer of 2016, they will formally decide that. However, at this point in American history, the conventions are merely formalities. We already know who the nominee will be because we've seen who has won the primaries and caucuses all around the country. And since we already know who's won those, we already know who the nominee is. This is just a way to make it official. At this time, vice presidential candidates are chosen at the convention, even though much of that already happened as well. That happens kind of in the shadows of the convention. And the party's platform is approved. The platform is the statement of the party's political beliefs. Then we get to the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is a very controversial way of picking presidential candidates. So after we get a nominee for each of the two major parties, and after the third parties and the various states, they try to get on the ballot, then it's up to the Electoral College. So essentially what happens here is the presidential candidate who gets above 270 electoral votes becomes the president. Now, most of the states in the country are locked in as either Democrat or Republican. About 6 or 7 states, depending on the election cycle, are considered competitive. These competitive states are known as swing states because they could swing to be Democrat or swing to be a Republican. Here I've listed the most common swing states: Colorado, Florida, Nevada, Ohio, Virginia, Iowa, and New Hampshire. All are states that could go one way, could go the others. And because the Electoral College is set up in the way that it is, much of the candidates' time will be focused on the states that could go Democrat or could go Republican, because the rest of the country is generally already decided. If you take a look at the map, here is the 2012 presidential election Electoral College vote results. The blue are the Democratic victories, the red are the Republican victories. And as you see there, Obama in 2012 took 332 Electoral College votes to Romney's 206. You could see that Obama in 2012 took a number of swing states, including Ohio, he took Nevada, he took Florida. After you get those swing states locked in, then that means that your victory is pretty close to being decided. This map shows you the importance of each state according to their electoral votes. So you can see California and Texas are great big. New York is up there. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois. Those are big states. Florida's a big state. Some states barely matter at all. Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana. States like that only have the minimum number of 3 Electoral College votes, and as such, Very few candidates ever visit those states because they're not considered to be very important. Here's what's shaping up to be battleground states for 2016. And you can kind of predict right now, based on past election results, how states will vote. So the West Coast tends to be very Democratic. The Northeast tends to be very Democratic. The center of the country and the South tends to be Republican. And those states that you see in gray there, those are the ones that are considered up for grabs. So those are the states that have electoral college votes that could go to Democrat or Republican. And you also have some states that are leaning Republican or leaning Democrat. And those are in the light red or the light blue colors. So that's what it's shaping up like in 2016. This is a pretty typical modern American electoral college map, though certainly over time population shifts have changed the political makeup of the states, and as the country continues to move around, that will continue to happen. All right, let's take a question here. In a paragraph, at least a paragraph, tell me what the Electoral College does. What are the results of the Electoral College? And by that I mean, what are some of the weird outcomes that can happen? Are these outcomes good or bad? Should we keep the Electoral College, change it, get rid of it, and then explain why? So take a moment and look at the Electoral College and really evaluate its role in American democracy. All right, let's spend some time now talking about what happens during the presidential campaign. First, I want to evaluate some of the different kinds of issues that are discussed in presidential campaigns. One is known as a valence issue. This is an issue on which most people share the same position. These are the most boring issues. Every politician has to come out and talk about how he or she is going to make a lot of jobs, American labor is the best, freedom of speech is our most fundamental right, etc., support the troops, all this stuff. Valence issues are things that everybody rallies around. Everyone has the same position. No one's going to come in front of a group of Americans and say, I think the job market is fine, everyone's got enough opportunity, let's just leave it alone. They're all going to talk about creating jobs and creating growth. These are valence issues. Opposite of this is a position issue. A position issue is one where the parties disagree. So, for example, with job creation, Democrats lean towards creating jobs in green energy, creating jobs through government spending, building highways, building bridges, building parks, improving parks, things like that. Republicans, on the other hand, want the free market to create jobs. This is a position difference. Environmental protection, same thing. Democrats want a big, strong, bold government program to protect environmental qualities such as air quality, water quality, etc. Republicans prefer to let the market decide the value of environmental commodities. So these are positions that the candidates differ on. Your position on these issues will largely determine which party, if any, you align with. Now, there's also wedge issues. Wedge issues are controversial issues that one party uses against the other party. Wedge issues are how campaigns are won. If you can use a wedge issue effectively in a presidential campaign against the other side, you will split that party's voters, get some of those voters to jump ship and vote your way, or stay home and not vote at all, and you may win the campaign. A few examples. Affirmative action in the Democratic Party. Liberal Democrats are very for affirmative action. They think this is a great idea. They think it is a strong way to remediate historical injustice. Moderate Democrats don't feel that way. So if you are a liberal Democrat coming and you are trying to run a liberal campaign, you might turn off your moderate voters. Your moderate voters might flip and vote Republican, or they just might not vote at all. Immigration is that issue for Republicans. So if you're a Republican, there are conservatives that are saying things like build a fence on the border, put up a gate, hire more security guards. Moderate Republicans are more for allowing immigration to happen, promoting it, fostering a healthier way to have large numbers of immigrants as into our labor force. The Democrats will use immigration against Republicans. They will point to the most conservative position about building walls and keeping immigrants out, and that will turn off moderate Republicans, and the moderate Republicans might go for a Democratic candidate who appeals to them more on that issue. As we're talking about that, the parties do have a tendency to be more competent in specific policy areas. This is known as issue ownership. On some issues, Democrats are just better than Republicans, or they're perceived to be better, and Republicans are perceived to be better than Democrats on some other things. So, for example, a lot of Americans, if you ask them, think Democrats are better on the economy, but Republicans are better on foreign policy. These are issues that have been owned by these two parties. Now, how do voters know about these issues? It's through advertising, especially negative advertising. Negative advertising is massively powerful in a campaign. Badly portraying your opponent is one way to turn off that opponent's voters, make them stay home or jump ship and vote for you. And it's a way to promote yourself by dragging down your opponent. It's very, very common, though very much complained about in our political system. Candidates will also appear on what we call soft news programs. These are news programs that are on during the daytime, where they are asked very simple questions and they respond in easy ways. They'll also appear on entertainment. They will come on things like Saturday Night Live. They will come on The Daily Show. These are ways to get the candidate's message out to a group of friendly voters. And then obviously debates are important. The presidential debates are a way for voters to look at these two individuals, or more individuals perhaps, who are running, and determine if these are the right people. So debates, especially televised debates, still matter. I've got pictures up here for you of one very famous debate and one somewhat famous debate. The image on the left is Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy in their debate in the 1960 presidential election. Now, what you can't see here, and what you might not know, is that before this debate happened, Nixon was coming off of a long, hard campaign event. He was tired, he was worn out. He also refused to wear makeup because he believed that makeup was only for women. This was at the very beginning of the television era. John F. Kennedy, on the other hand, understood television, understood how that media could be used to his advantage, and he portrayed himself on the debate stage as a television-era president, and he went on to win that presidential campaign. On the right-hand side, you see Barack Obama and Mitt Romney going after each other. In this campaign, in this debate, there were no podiums. So the two were free to approach each other and walk away from each other as they would. It provided a very interesting and somewhat aggressive debate format. Now, how do we pay for debates and advertising and all of this? It is money. If you ask Americans what is wrong with American democracy, most of them will say the money is the problem, but most of them do not understand why that is so. You can get money to fund your presidential campaign in three ways. First is what we call government matching funds. If you take funds from the government to run your campaign, you are then not allowed to take the soft money that we'll talk about in a moment, that everyone generally takes to run your campaign. So if you allow the government to pay for your presidential campaign, that is fine, but then you'll have campaign spending limits that are much tighter than anyone else's. You won't be able to spend as much money as other candidates, and the less money you spend, the less well known you'll be, and as such, the lower your chances are of becoming president. The other two sources of money are called hard money and soft money. Hard money is money given directly to the candidate by people, by political organizations, etc. It is subject to very strict rules. You can only take so much from an individual person. You can only spend it in such and such way. This is opposed to soft money. Soft money is raised by political parties, by interest groups, and by political action committees. And this can be spent on anything to help the candidate. Almost anything to help the candidate, and it is raised in unlimited amounts. So when people are talking about the problem of money in politics, they're really talking about soft money, which is unlimited, essentially. Much of this soft money goes to pay for issue advocacy ads. These are ads that are not actually about a candidate, but it's about an issue. And what will happen in a presidential campaign is that certain candidates get associated with certain issues, and then when these ads play on TV, then people understand that these ads that are about an issue are actually about the candidate themselves. And as this can be done in an unlimited fashion, that means that there's unlimited opportunities to attack candidates if you have the money to put the ads on TV. Before we end this section on the presidential campaign, there's one thing you must understand in modern presidential elections is a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. In the Supreme Court case, which happened in 2010, the Supreme Court decided that the First Amendment prohibits the limitation of campaign spending by corporations and labor unions, because essentially they are saying that the campaign financing, spending money on an election, that is free speech. This has the effect of allowing unlimited amounts of money to be spent on campaigns by those willing to raise it and spend it. And as you can see here, this decision is very, very unpopular with Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. Most people very much dislike this idea. Most people view this as being a gateway to allow as much unregulated money into a presidential election as possible, and there's significant opposition to Citizens United. So you might hear about Citizens United, and you should know that that is a Supreme Court case that allowed unlimited, nearly unlimited soft money spending. Question. Tell me about Citizens United. Was this a good idea or bad idea? Tell me what you think, explain why in a paragraph. One of the other important forces to discuss in terms of modern American politics are interest groups. An interest group is any organization of individuals who share a common goal and are united for the purpose of influencing government decisions. So an interest group could be almost anything: environmental groups, business groups, labor groups, social groups, racial and ethnic groups. Even foreign countries form their own interest groups. And what they do is they then form a political action committee. A political action committee raises money to spend on elections. I've given you there the logo of the Ohio Dairy Producers Association, their PAC, which is a actually fairly powerful political organization inside the state of Ohio. But there are many, many political action committees like that one who are out there spending money on behalf of candidates. Interest groups represent public interests, but they only represent a narrow band of public interests. So interest groups tend to be about one particular thing. The American Civil Liberties Union is just about protecting the freedoms contained inside the Bill of Rights. How interest groups do this is generally by lobbying. Lobbying is a way for interest groups to meet with politicians. They help write legislation. They communicate the group's ideas. And they do this with the idea that if you support us, if we are the Sierra Club, a major environmental interest group, and we go and meet with a senator, and that senator agrees with our positions, then our voters, our Sierra Club voters, will vote for that senator or presidential candidate or what have you. Interest groups also educate voters. They also push their agendas. And many interest groups are actively involved in writing and suggesting laws. So some of the laws on the books are not written by politicians, they're written by interest groups. Interest groups form for all sorts of different reasons. Some are based on the perception of a threat. Environmental threats formed the Sierra Club. Civil rights threats formed the NAACP. Threats to gun ownership formed the NRA. Some interest groups form in order to harness resources for a particular group of people. The most famous of this is the Association for the Advancement of Retired People, the AARP, and their goal is to get the ideas of retirees out there and to make sure that retirees are being taken care of. Some interest groups form around effective leaders. I've given you some examples down there at the bottom. But interest groups face a problem, and this problem is common in any kind of democratic system, and that is the problem of free ridership. A free rider is someone that benefits from the interest group working, but doesn't actually do anything to help the group. So you may think to yourself, I really enjoy clean air, clean water, but the Sierra Club's already taken care of that for me. I don't actually have to do anything to help them out. So why should I bother joining? Why should I send in my $30 a year? Why bother? And this generally is a problem with any kind of collective good. A collective good is anything that cannot be denied to anyone who wants it. Clean air is a great example. You cannot just say, well, you people over here, you didn't pay anything for clean air, you don't get it. Instead, everyone breathes the same air. So if only the American Lung Association and the Sierra Club are working on getting us free air, and we aren't all working on behalf of the Sierra Club and the American Lung Association, then we're all free riders. And there's different incentives you can use to get people to join, to fight that and everything. But it's really a problem in modern America where a lot of people believe in something or benefit from something, but they aren't willing to do any work to make that happen. Question. Tell me about this free rider problem. Go into it in a bit more depth. Why does it exist? In what ways are you a free rider? And don't use the example of clean air. Find something else. And how can you solve this problem? I'll give you a hint. Solving the problem of free ridership involves joining up and being politically active. That's just a little tip from me to you. Take a moment, pause the video, and when you're ready, resume. Now, inside of interest groups, you obviously have citizens, and we can view this in a few different ways. The pluralists in American politics argue the interest groups are fantastic. They equalize people in American politics. So if the NAACP is out there pushing for rights for African Americans, that is good. They are organized. They are representing that entire group, even if that entire group is not a member of the NAACP. However, the elitist in political science circles suggest that interest groups aren't always that egalitarian. Instead, what they do is they take resources and they skew them towards the wealthy. Wealthy people form interest groups, they join interest groups. This means that most interest groups are not out there for poor people, rather they're out there for middle class and upper class individuals. And all of this depends on how willing people are to organize at the grassroots level. So, follow-up question. Tell me some advantages and disadvantages of interest groups' participation in American politics. Is there a way we can improve this participation? Should we disband interest groups? Take a moment, answer the question, and when you are ready, resume. Now, let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, the media. Americans complain about the media all the time. They view the media as overly biased, as pointing people in the wrong direction, as being controlled by wealthy elites. Let's take a few minutes and really break that down and see who is controlling the media and why do we care. First, what is the media? The media, for our purposes today, is where we get our information. There are other forms of media that are for entertainment and things like that. We're less concerned with that today. Today we're talking about information-based media. Historically, Americans got their media from newspapers. However, newspapers are very much on the decline. There are fewer newspapers now in most of the industrialized world, and now in America, only 7% of people read a national paper, 44% read local papers, but if this were half a century ago, those numbers would be much, much, much higher. Radio is another place to get the news. Not a lot of people in younger age groups get their news from the radio, but you can. Here's an example. This tracks from 2004 to 2014. The number of people who read a newspaper each week is the blue line. And the number of people who use the internet once a week to get news is the orange line. So now we've really reached a tipping point where most people are accessing the internet more frequently to get news than they are reading a newspaper. These trends will probably continue into the future as we move into an era of a highly internet-based society. Television is the other major place to get news. Television is a dramatic shift in human evolution to how we get news. We now don't hear about a story, we aren't told a story, we are being shown a story. We can see the images on the screen, we can see what is happening. That's a big deal. Human beings are able to relate to an image, especially a moving image like a video, much more than they are to a story. So television news is very, very important. Half of Americans watch the local news, about 39% watch cable news, and about 36% watch network news. That would be like nightly news on the major networks. So a lot of us are getting news via TV, and there are a lot of issues in the reporting of this news and how it's given to us. 20% of us report getting our political news from the internet, but that number goes up every year. So that's 20% of people who don't watch TV news, they don't read the newspaper, they're only online. This is a very interactive form of media. If you're on the internet, you are selecting stories to click on that you think are interesting. You're not sitting in front of a screen and having stories presented to you. And what this has given rise to is what we call informal news sources. These are blogs and Reddit posts and YouTube videos and things like that that are non-professional people giving us our news. And there are a host of issues with that, including issues relating to the quality of the news, the content you get, and the bias that might be present there. So let's take a moment and answer this question. What are the advantages and disadvantages of obtaining most of your news from the internet? Try to be specific here. Really think through, what is this doing when I'm just logging on to get my news? What's the impact of that? Take a moment, answer that question, and then when you are ready, return. All right, we are about done with our video here today, but before we finish, I want to talk about where people get their news and what impact does that have. One rule to keep in mind, most media today is controlled by concentrated corporate power. A handful, and by handful I mean 4 to 5, companies own almost all of the media. This has tended to reduce the emphasis on political news. It has led to bias and a new kind of notion of infotainment. If you watch news on Fox News, for example, a lot of that is infotainment. You're getting information, but it's packaged in a fast-paced, way where celebrities or people that look like celebrities are giving you the news. It looks like entertainment. There are a host of issues relating to conflicts of interest. When a corporate owner of a news company, it has to report on a story that is condemnatory or negative towards a company owned by that corporation. So, for example, GE is owned by NBC. I'm sorry, flip that. NBC is owned by GE, General Electric. So when NBC has to report on GE polluting the Hudson River in New York State, they may be hesitant to do that because those are the people that own the company. That's a conflict of interest. This is a problem that is so rampant in our media system that most people pay very little attention to it. There are alternatives to corporate media, and those of you who are out there watching this thinking, I need to find better information to be an informed citizen, first, I applaud you, and second, I point you in these directions. First, public radio and public television. NPR, PBS, these tend to be less biased. They also tend to give much more in-depth coverage of stories so that you can make better decisions. There is alternative, non-corporate owned press such as Village Voice. There are ideological magazines for either the left or the right. And then there's the internet, citizen journalism. So there's ways to get your information that are not controlled by corporations, and I strongly encourage you to find some of those. Now let's turn to the question of how does the media shape public opinion? The first way it does that is, and this is probably the most important, is it sets the agenda. People can only be informed about issues that are presented in the media. There are some issues that are simply never presented to the people. So if people never hear about something on the news, they are never going to have an opinion. There are many issues in the country that are like this that are simply not on the agenda. These tend to be the least pleasant issues to talk about, things like sex trafficking, the treatment of homeless veterans, things like this, that are simply not on the agenda. They are not presented by news corporations. Some news corporations will not present issues on the agenda. They will not put them on their shows. They will not put them on their websites if that issue goes against what that corporation believes. Fox News is very famous for doing this. They almost never report anything about climate change, for example, because the owner of Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, which is one of the wealthiest people in the world, is a strong climate change denier. As such, those stories either don't make the Fox News networks, or if they do, they are presented in a slanted way such that they are not really presenting accurate fact. The other thing the media does is what we call priming. So the media will prime people's perceptions. They will make you think a certain thing about people. They will give certain characteristics to people by presenting them in a certain way or certain issues. So, for example, when the media portrays someone like Ben Carson is portrayed to look like he is out of touch with reality. How does this happen? The media plays us clips of Ben Carson saying things that might not make the most sense when taken out of context, or perhaps when taken in context for that matter. But the media primes you. It gets you ready for that response. Then the media can frame the issue. The media will emphasize certain parts of a news story. This will influence your perception of the story. This is very common in times of war. In times of war, when American troops are going into Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, what have you, when that happens, the media will present it as a patriotic duty. These soldiers are in this country fighting this war for our freedom, etc., etc. They will frame that part of the issue. They will leave out something as important as the impact of the war on the people that live in that country. They will frame the issue, they will frame the event in a way that is pleasing to their viewers, not necessarily in a way that gives you an accurate picture of the issue at hand. Another way they can shape public opinion is by using professional communicators. And this is what a journalist is. A journalist is a professional communicator who can tell you about an issue in a way that makes you understand and empathize with the people involved. Here you see one of the greatest American journalists, a man named Walter Cronkite, reporting on the assassination of President Kennedy. When people turned to Walter Cronkite, and this was in the 1960s obviously, to see him on TV, they trusted him. He was someone that when he reported the news, they had faith and belief and trust in Walter Cronkite. And if he told you something was one way, many people believed it. So the power of personality in the news media should not be overlooked. A few issues related to politics and journalism specifically is politics is often seen as kind of another sporting event. And we call journalism that encourages this, we call it horse race journalism, where we are focusing on just the competitive elements of politics, rather than policies, rather on the cost and benefits of a certain course of action. We're just focused on who has the most votes, who has the most support, who has the highest public opinion ratings. Sometimes politicians do things that are unpopular but are correct. They have the right outcome. And focusing on the horse race of whether that's a popular thing to do really negates, or at least detracts from, this notion of we want politicians to be people who make wise political decisions and good choices regardless of their popularity. And this comes back to an emphasis on image. I put a picture here that's widely circulated on the internet of Hillary Clinton. Everyone knows Hillary Clinton's a reasonable person. She is not a lunatic, but clearly here she's being depicted as someone who's lost touch with reality. But there's really a lot of scandal watching in politics. News outlets, if they hear of a scandal, they will rush to it. They will concentrate on it. They will do this to the exclusion of other more relevant news events. There you have an image from Time magazine about Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton and their extramarital affair that they had, and all these things. While that was happening in the mid-90s, the country faced serious problems of unemployment, climate change, urban decay. But we weren't focused on that. We were focused on Bill Clinton's scandal. And the media is responsible for that because they're the people who will put the images out, put the stories out, and have us focus on those stories. And this has led to negativism, cynicism. Reporters are cynical, the people become cynical, and really the entire political system takes on this atmosphere of almost like a gotcha circus, where everyone's out to get everyone else, and no one's doing what's right. People are doing what looks right, or what will harm their opponent. Final question. In no less than a paragraph, and this is one you'll probably want to take a bit more time with, talk about media and politics. What do they do? What is the impact that they have? Talk about positives, talk about negatives, bring it all together in one cohesive essay. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoy the video.